The Raven's Eclipse. Chapter 1, The Ash and the Iron. The fjord did not bleed all at once. It began with the grease of whale blubber and the salt crust of a dying winter, but by the time the longships cleared the mist-shrouded teeth of the Ormtongue, the water turned the color of a bruised plum. Thorstein Sigurdsson stood at the prow of the Naglfar's wake, his fingers frozen to the carved oak of the dragon head. He was 35 winters old, which made him an old man among those who earned their bread by the edge of the sacks. His beard was less gold now and more the color of wet river gravel, bound in 3 tight braids to keep it from his eyes when the shield wall closed. "The wind favors the dead today, uncle," a voice rasped from behind him. Thorstein didn't turn. He knew the cadence of Halvar's breath, shallow, quick, smelling of sour ale and the dried fish they had chewed since the moon was full. Halvar was his sister's eldest, 19 summers, with skin still smooth enough to show the flush of fear when the cold bit deep. "The wind favors the man who rows hardest," Thorstein said, his voice like grindstone on iron. "Keep your eyes on the headland. If Halder the Black has set the beacons, we'll see the smoke before we see the steel." Behind them, 60 men sat on their sea chests, their oars dipping in a rhythm as steady as the heartbeat of a dying whale. They were men of the Hardinge, farmers who had traded the plough for the ash-haft, younger sons with nothing to inherit but their father's rusted ringmail, and a handful of berserker who sat in the waist of the ship, staring at their own scarred knees, already humming the low, droning songs that brought the bear madness down from the hills. They were raiding no foreign shore today. There were no fat monks to slaughter, no silver chalices to tear from Latin altars. This was the worst kind of war. Norseman against Norseman, brother against first cousin, fought over 300 paces of rocky shoreline and the right to call a strip of frozen mud home. The breaking of the shield. The attack came not from the shore, but from the shadow of the cliffs. 2 longships, lower in the water and broader than Thorstein's craft, shot out from the kelp-choked narrows. Their shields were painted a dull, uniform charcoal, the mark of Jarl Eric's personal huskarls. "Up!" Thorstein roared, his voice cutting through the slap of the surf. "Shields to the rail! Hold your oars, you dogs, or the sea will have your boots before the crows have your eyes." The transition from rowers to killers was a dance they had performed since boyhood. Oars were pulled skinned in, iron-rimmed linden shields slid into the slots along the gunwale with a series of heavy clacks. Then came the arrows. They did not fall like rain, they flew flat and hard across the grey water. An arrow tipped with bog iron struck the Naglfar's wake 3 feet below Thorstein's boots, splintering the pine planking with a sound like a cracking whip. Another found the throat of an oarsman named Got. He didn't scream, he merely made a wet, bubbling sound and sat down heavily against his chest, his hands fluttering over the ash shaft protruding from his neck. "Brace!" Halvar yelled, his voice cracking. The collision was a physical thing. A groan of timber that vibrated through Thorstein's teeth as the enemy ship's iron-shod prow sheared through their starboard oars. Men were thrown into a heap in the bilge. The smell of split wood and old bilge water rose instantly, mixed with the sharp, metallic tang of drawn swords. Thorstein didn't wait for the ships to be lashed together. He stepped onto the gunwale, his bearded axe, viper's tongue, raised high, and leaped into the belly of the foe. The law of the edge. To the poets in the great halls of Hedeby, war was a matter of soaring eagles and the choice of the Valkyries. To Thorstein, it was a matter of mud and balance. He landed on an enemy oarsman, crushing the man's chest beneath his iron-shod boots. Before the man's comrade could turn, Thorstein drove the horn of his axe into the soft flesh beneath the rim of the man's helmet. The iron bit stuck for a heartbeat in the jawbone, and came away with a sickening suck. "Sigurdsson!" A voice bellowed through the din. Across the narrow deck stood a Scot, a man Thorstein had shared salt with at the last winter solstice. The Scot's shield was split down the middle, held together only by the rawhide rim, but his right hand held a heavy, broad-bladed sword that had belonged to his grandfather. "You should have stayed in the west, Thorstein!" A Scot shouted, spitting blood onto the frost-rimed planks. "The Jarl has promised your hall to his hounds." "Let him try to feed them my hearthstones," Thorstein muttered. They met in the center of the ship, where the rolling of the swell made every step a gamble with the Norns. A Scot struck first, a sweeping overhead blow that would have cleaved Thorstein from shoulder to hip had he blocked with his axe haft. Instead, Thorstein stepped inside the ark, letting the sword slide off the iron boss of his shield. The wood groaned. The impact went through Thorstein's shoulder like lightning, but he used the momentum to drive his forehead straight into a Scott's nose. The crunch of cartilage was distinct. A Scott stumbled back, his eyes watering, his sword swinging wildly. It was an error a boy would make. Thorstein didn't waste the gift. He brought Viper's tongue down in a short, brutal arc, catching a Scott where the neck met the shoulder. The mailshirt held for a fraction of a second before the iron links burst like rotten thread. The Scott went down, his blood pumping into the low puddle of water in the ship's bottom, his eyes fixed on the gray sky as if looking for something that wasn't there. The cost of iron. By the time the sun had climbed 3 fingers above the eastern peaks, the fighting was done. The 2 enemy ships were drifting hulls, their decks silent save for the groans of those whose wounds were too deep for the iron tether to mend quickly. Thorstein sat on the gunwale of his own ship, washing his hands in the freezing salt water. His knuckles were split, and a shallow graze across his cheek was already thickening into a stiff crust of black blood. Halvar approached him, holding a silver-gilt armring he had taken from one of the dead. The boy's hands were shaking so hard the silver clinked against his iron mail. "We won the water," Halvar whispered, looking back at the red foam trailing behind them. Thorstein looked past the boy, toward the headland where the smoke of the village beacons was finally beginning to rise, not white and thin, as a signal of welcome, but thick, black, and greasy with the fat of burning timber. "We won the water," Thorstein agreed, his voice flat, his eyes fixed on the burning shore. "But the land belongs to the crows. Pack your shields, boys. The real harvest hasn't even begun." Chapter 2, The Ashfall. The smoke from the headland did not rise into the sky, the heavy northern air pressed it down, turning it into a black grease that coated the surface of the fjord. As the remaining oarsmen of the Naglfar's wake drove the ship through the shallows, the hull ground against the shingle with a sound like teeth chewing bone. "Oars up!" Thorstein shouted, his voice hoarse from the salt and the screaming. "Every man with his iron out. If you see a shadow in the smoke, you split it." The village of Hunstock was no longer a village. It was a collection of blackened ribs. The great timber frames of the longhouses, built from old-growth pine that had stood since the days of the first settlers, were collapsing inward, throwing showers of orange sparks into the gray sky. The smell was a sickening mixture of roasted barley, burnt thatch, and pork, though every man on the ship knew there were no pigs left in Hunstock by the 3rd month of winter. Halvar was the first over the rail, his boots splashing into the knee-deep ice water. He stumbled, his shield catching a wave, but he caught himself, his knuckles white around the grip of his spear. "Uncle," he breathed, looking at the shore. "There are no lookouts." "There are always lookouts," Thorstein said, stepping down into the surf with the slow, deliberate grace of a predator. "They are just waiting until we are too deep in the mud to swing our axes." He looked along the line of the beach. 3 other longships from the Hardinge fleet were beaching to their left, their crews spilling onto the dark stones like ants from a ruined hill. Among them was Kveldulf, a giant of a man whose beard was dyed red with madder root, his 2-handed Danax already resting across his massive shoulder. "Thorstein!" Kveldulf bellowed, his voice booming over the crackle of the fires. "The Black Hound has been here and gone. He's taken the cattle and the women up to the ridge fort." "He didn't leave the place empty, Kveldulf," Thorstein said, pointing Viper's tongue toward the ruins of the smithy. "Look at the crows." The birds were not circling, they were sitting on the low stone walls, their heads tilted, waiting. The trap in the reeds. The advance up the shingle was slow. The men formed a loose skjoldborg, a shield wall 3 ranks deep, their shields overlapping to form a roof of painted wood and iron bosses against any archers hidden in the chart structures. The attack didn't come from the front. From the drainage ditches behind the burnt granary, 20 men rose like ghosts from the peat. They wore no bright mail or silvered helmets, they were wrapped in boiled leather and wolfskins, their faces blackened with soot. These were Jarl Eric's Skraeling killers, men kept for the dirty work of the borders, who knew how to kill a man while he slept and skin a dog without making it howl. A low, whistling roar went through the air as 3-pronged fishing spears and heavy throwing axes rained down on Thorstein's flank. A man to Thorstein's right, a young farmer named Erling, took a short iron dart straight through his eye-slit. He dropped without a sound, his shield clattering against the stones. "Close the wall!" Halvar screamed, panic turning his voice into a shrill whistle. "Don't bunch up!" Thorstein countered, his voice a hammer blow of authority. "They want us in a knot. Halvar, take 5 men and clear the ditch. Kveldolv, with me." Thorstein broke from the line, his heavy boots tearing through the wet sand. A Skraeling rushed him, lunging with a rusted boar spear. The thrust was fast, aimed at Thorstein's unarmored thigh, but Thorstein had fought in the shield walls of the south against the Franks, he knew the weight of a thrust. He didn't block with his shield. He used the flat of Viper's tongue to slap the spearhead aside, then stepped forward, driving his iron-shod knee straight into the man's groin. As the man doubled over, Thorstein brought the butt spike of his axe down into the base of the skull. The bone gave way with a sharp tack, like a dry hazelnut under a heel. To his left, Kveldolv was a whirlwind of iron. His massive axe cleared a 5-pace circle, shearing through arms, wooden shield bosses, and the necks of those unlucky enough to be within his reach. The giant was laughing, a terrifying, booming sound that drifted through the smoke like the barking of a troll. But the Skraelings were not there to win, they were there to delay. The message on the post. By the time the last of the ambushers had been hunted down into the marshy reeds and stuck like hogs, the smoke had begun to clear from the center of the village. There, where the Thingstead, the stone circle where the free men met to cast their laws, had stood for generations, a single high post of ashwood had been driven into the earth. Thorstein approached it, his breathing heavy, his axe dripping dark, thick blood onto the blackened grass. The men followed him, their weapons lowered, their anger cooling into a cold, heavy dread. Nailed to the post by an iron spike through the throat was the head of Sigmund, Thorstein's elder brother and the law-speaker of the Hardanger. His silver hair was matted with old blood and grease, his mouth locked open in a final, silent cry that had been frozen by the northern wind. Below the head, carved into the fresh white wood of the peeled post, were 3 runes: Nodis, Ices, Uras. Need. Ice. Ruin. Halvar fell to his knees before the post, his spear dropping from his hand. He didn't cry, he simply stared at his father's face, his chest heaving as if he had run 10 leagues through the deep snow. "They did this before they fired the hall," Halvar whispered. He was the law-speaker. Even the Jarl must respect the law-speaker. "The Jarl has 50 longships and 300 huskarls," Thorstein said, his voice dropping an octave until it sounded like stone sliding over stone. "He is the law now." Kveldolv spat on the ground, his laughter gone. "The ridge-ford is 2 hours' climb, Thorstein. The path is narrow. 1 man at the top can hold off 20 below. If we go up there now, in the dark, we go into the mouth of the wolf." Thorstein reached up, his leather-gloved hands surprisingly gentle as he closed his brother's dead eyes. He pulled the iron spike from the wood with a single, violent wrench, taking the head into his arms and wrapping it in his own blue wool cloak. "We don't go up the path," Thorstein said, turning to face his remaining men. His eyes were no longer gray, they seemed to reflect the dull, angry red of the dying fires. "The Black Hound thinks we will stay here and weep over the ash. He thinks we will wait for the dawn." He looked up at the ridge, where the faint light of the fort's torches could be seen through the mountain mist. "We go up the goat's ladder," Thorstein said. A murmur went through the men. The goat's ladder was not a path, it was a sheer cliff face on the western side of the ridge, where the rocks were loose and the wind from the sea hit with enough force to rip a man from the stone. "No man can climb that in mail, Thorstein," Kveldolv said, his brow furrowing. "Not with iron on his back." "Then we leave the mail," Thorstein replied, unbuckling the iron-ringed shirt from his shoulders and letting it drop into the mud with a heavy, metallic sigh. "We take only the sacks, the axe, and our bare hands. If the Norns have spun our threads to end on the rocks, then we die fat on the stones. But if we reach the top..." He looked at Halvar, who was now standing, his eyes clear and dark with a cold, adult hatred. "If we reach the top," Thorstein whispered, "we show them what happens when you wake the men of the Hardanger." Chapter 3, The Goat's Ladder. The wind off the North Sea did not merely blow, it bit. It carried the microscopic shards of the high glaciers, whipping them against the bare skin of the men who clung to the dark, wet schist of the mountain. They had left their mail shirts in a heap among the ashes of Hunstock, looking like the shed skins of iron serpents. Now, clad only in thick woolen tunics, leather breeches, and soft-soled hide boots, 60 men crawled up the vertical spine of the ridge. Thorstein went first. His fingers were no longer fingers, they were numb, bleeding hooks that sought out every crack, every frozen root, every ledge no wider than a knife's edge. Viper's tongue was slung across his back, the leather wrap around its blade cold against his spine. "Don't look down, Halvar," Thorstein hissed into the darkness above the roar of the gale. A dozen paces below him, the boy was clinging to a slab of black rock that ran slick with freezing condensation. A single misstep meant a fall of 400 paces into the jagged teeth of the fjord's shingle. There would be no burial mound for a man who fell from the ladder, the tide would have his bones before the sun rose. Suddenly, a sharp crack echoed through the dark. A stone the size of a horse's head had broken loose from the shelf above. It plunged through the night, striking the cliff face with a shower of orange sparks. A muffled scream followed. It was young Erling's cousin, a lad of 17 winters named Thorin. He hadn't even the time to call upon Odin before the rock took him. The sound of his body hitting the scree far below was lost in the howling of the wind, but the silence that followed among the climbing men was heavier than any thunder. "Keep moving," Thorstein growled, his teeth grinding until they ached. "If you stop, the frost will lock your knees. Move." The lip of the well. After what felt like 3 lifetimes in the dark, Thorstein's hand encountered something that was not frozen stone, it was horizontal timber. He had reached the base of the ridge fort's rear palisade. Unlike the front gate, which was guarded by 2 heavy towers and a ditch of sharpened stakes, this side faced the abyss. Jarl Eric's men had built the wall right to the edge of the cliff, believing that only crows and spirits could approach from the west. Thorstein hoisted himself up onto a narrow ledge of dirt just beneath the logs. He lay there for a moment, his chest heaving, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. One by one, the dark shapes of his men spilled over the lip behind him. Kveldulv arrived, his face white from the exertion, his massive hands trembling as he gripped his great axe. "The wind is a whore," the giant wheezed, spitting a mouthful of bloody phlegm onto the wood. Thorstein held up a hand. Above them, on the other side of the pine-log palisade, they could hear the sounds of celebration. Jarl Eric's huskarls had found the village ale stores. There were shouts, the coarse laughter of men who believed they had already won the day, and the rhythmic thumping of iron cups against oak tables. "They are drunk on my brother's mead," Halvar whispered, his teeth chattering from the cold, but his eyes burning like hot coals. "Then it will be the last thing they taste," Thorstein said. He leaned against the palisade, searching for a gap. The logs were old, lashed together with heavy hemp ropes that had rotted from the salt air. He found a section where the timber had shifted, leaving a gap wide enough for a hand. Thorstein slipped his long sax, the single-edged scramasax, from its sheath. He didn't use his axe yet, an axe was for the open field, for the noise of the shield wall. Here, they needed the silence of the knife. The shadow in the yard. Thorstein wriggled through a gap where the earth had eroded beneath the logs, dragging himself into the dirt of the fort's inner yard. The air inside smelled different, of horse dung, roasting mutton, and the sour stink of cheap grain spirit. A fire pit blazed 30 paces away, casting long, dancing shadows against the walls of the Jarl's hall. A single guard stood near the horse stables, leaning heavily against a spear. His helmet was tilted back, and he was humming a tune from the southern lands, his mind miles away from the freezing dark of the cliffside. Thorstein rose from the shadows like grease rising on water. His boots made no sound on the packed earth. He was 5 paces away when the guard turned. The man's eyes widened, reflecting the orange light of the fire pit, but before he could draw breath to yell, Thorstein closed the distance. His left hand clamped over the guard's mouth, the leather glove stifling the sound into a dull grunt. At the same instant, Thorstein drove his sax upward, just beneath the man's jaw, through the soft tongue root and into the brain. The guard's body went limp immediately, his spear clattering into the straw. Thorstein lowered him gently, his eyes already sweeping the yard. Behind him, Kveldulv and Halvar were through the wall, followed by 30 more men. The rest were still climbing, but they could not wait. The fire pit was dying, and someone would soon come out to tend it or to relieve the watch. Halvar, take 3 men and secure the stable doors. Don't let them get to the horses, Thorstein ordered in a low whisper. Kveldolv, with me to the heavy doors of the hall. We bar them from the outside if we can, or we go in if we must. Let's go in, Kveldolv grinned, a feral, terrifying look in the firelight. I want to see the Jarl's face when he realizes the dead have come up from the sea. The breaking of the feast. They never reached the doors. The heavy oak portals of the great hall swung open with a bang, and a man stumbled out into the yard, holding an empty earthenware jug. It was one of the Jarl's captains, a man known as Thorstein the Red, his beard stained with spilled ale. He looked straight at Thorstein. For 2 heartbeats, the only sound was the wind howling outside the walls and the crackle of the pine knots in the fire pit. Sigurdsson? Thorstein the Red muttered, squinting through the gloom as if seeing a ghost. You're dead. The ships took you at the mouth. The sea didn't want us, Thorstein said. The captain opened his mouth to roar, but Thorstein didn't give him the breath. He threw his sacks. The heavy blade turned once in the air, entering Thorstein the Red's throat with a heavy thunk. The man staggered backward, his hands grasping at the horn hilt sticking out of his neck, before crashing into the hall doors. The noise inside the hall died instantly. To me! Thorstein bellowed, discarding all silence now. He reached behind his back and drew Viper's tongue, the iron head gleaming under the torchlight. Hardinja! Odin! The men of the Naglfar's wake roared back. A primal, starving sound that tore through the mountain fort. They charged the doors just as the Jarl's huskarls inside scrambled for their weapons, the feast turning into a slaughterhouse before the first horn could be blown. Chapter 4, The Hall of Split Timber. The great doors of the hall did not slam shut, they were jammed by the twitching corpse of Thorstein the Red. Thorstein Sigurdsson hit the oak panel's shoulder first, driving his weight into the wood just as 2 huskarls on the inside tried to force it close. The timber groaned, iron hinges shrieking against the stone frame, and then the barrier gave way. Thorstein tumbled into the heat, the grease, and the blinding light of the great hall. The air inside was thick enough to chew. It smelled of spilled meat, roasting marrow, fat, and the unwashed wool of 80 men who had thought themselves safe behind stone and mountain. The cliff, someone screamed from the high tables at the back. They came up the cliff. Before the words had even cleared the man's teeth, Kveldolv stepped through the threshold. He didn't have room to swing his giant Danax in the narrow entryway, so he used it like a ram, driving the heavy iron-bound ash shaft straight into the chest of an oncoming warrior. The man's ribs snapped with the sound of dry pine branches under a boot, and he was thrown back into the central fire trench. The hall was a long, narrow tunnel of violence. Down the center ran the fire pit, filled with glowing peat coals that threw a hellish orange glare onto the rafter beams above. On either side were the long benches, now overturned as men scrambled for shields, axes, and swords that had been hung carelessly on the walls. Form the wedge! Thorstein roared, his axe Viper's tongue swinging in a short, vicious circle that cleaved the hand of a man reaching for a spear. Halvar! Keep the door behind us! The red tallow! There was no room for tactical grace. This was the Hogva, the hacking water. Thorstein advanced down the left side of the fire trench, his boots slipping on spilled grease and tallow. A huskarl rushed him, swinging a heavy Frankish sword. Thorstein caught the blow on his forearm, not on mail, for he had left it at the beach, but on the thick, boiled leather bracer he wore. The iron bit into the leather, stopping an inch from his bone. Thorstein didn't flinch. He wrenched his arm back, pulling the man's blade out of line, and drove the iron beak of his axe into the side of the man's knee. The joint shattered. As the warrior fell to his face, Thorstein finished him with a short, heavy stomp to the base of the skull. Sigurdsson! Through the smoke and the steam of the meat vats, a massive figure rose from the high seat at the end of the hall. It was not Jarl Erik, the Jarl was too old, too fat to leave his hall at Alrekstad. But his warlord, Halder the Black. Halder was a man built like an old oak trunk. His beard was black as charcoal, bound with silver wire, and his eyes were wide and yellowed with the ale rage. He wore a heavy coat of ringmail that came down to his knees, and in his right hand, he held a massive broadsword, its pommel shaped like a coiled serpent. "You should have drowned in the fjord, Thorstein," Halder bellowed, stepping down from the dais. He didn't look at his men who were falling around him. His eyes were locked on Thorstein's grey beard. "I killed your brother. I watched his blood freeze on the stone. I will have your tongue for a belt strap." "Come get it, dog," Thorstein said, his voice dropping into a cold, flat calm. The clash of old iron. The men around them fell back, creating a ragged ring of bloody wood and mud between the fire trench and the high benches. The battle still raged at the door, where Halvar and the younger men were holding off the Jarl's watchmen from the outer walls, but here, in the heart of the hall, the air went quiet save for the heavy breathing of two old killers. Halder struck first. For a man of his size, he moved with the speed of a striking adder. The serpent-hilted sword whistled through the smoke, a horizontal cut aimed at Thorstein's neck. Thorstein ducked beneath the blade, the wind of its passage whistling over his hair. He lunged forward, aiming a thrust with the point of viper's tongue at Halder's unarmored throat. But Halder was no farmer. He anticipated the move, dropping his heavy iron-rimmed shield down to intercept the axe head. The iron clattered against iron. Halder twisted his shield, trapping Thorstein's axe blade between the wood and the iron rim, and brought his sword down in a short, brutal arc aimed at Thorstein's shoulder. Thorstein couldn't pull his axe free in time. He threw himself to the left, but the sword still found him. It tore through his woolen tunic and bit deep into the muscle of his left shoulder. Blood, hot and dark, spurted out, soaking his sleeve instantly. "Uncle!" Halvar screamed from the door, but the boy was buried under two attackers and couldn't break away. Thorstein didn't cry out. The pain was there, a white-hot spike in his flesh, but he had lived with iron long enough to know that pain only kills if you let it look you in the eye. He let go of his axe haft with his left hand, leaving Viper's tongue stuck in Halder's shield, and drew his short sax from his hip with his right. The law of the knife. Halder laughed, a wet, confident sound, and raised his sword for the killing blow. "Die in the dark, Sigurdsson." He swung. But instead of blocking or dodging, Thorstein stepped into the blow. He let the flat of Halder's sword strike his injured shoulder, using the very momentum of the hit to drive himself inside the giant's reach, where the long sword was useless. They slammed together chest to chest. The iron rings of Halder's mailshirt dug into Thorstein's skin. Halder's breath smelled of old meat and stale ale, his yellow eyes widening in sudden, sharp realization. Thorstein's right arm was free. He didn't swing the sax, he used it like a chisel. He drove the heavy, single-edged blade upward, beneath the rim of Halder's mailshirt, right into the soft flesh of the groin where the femoral artery ran thick and deep. Halder stiffened. His sword dropped from his fingers, clattering onto the floorboards. Thorstein didn't pull the blade out. He twisted it, 90 degrees, horizontal to the bone, and leaned his entire weight onto the hilt. "That," Thorstein whispered into Halder's ear, his voice barely louder than the crackle of the fire, "is for Sigmund. That is for the law." Halder's yellow eyes rolled back into his head. A great, shuddering breath escaped his lips, carrying with it a spray of red foam, and then the giant collapsed forward, pinning Thorstein to the ground under his immense, mail-clad weight. The Ash King. For a moment, the hall was silent save for the roaring of the fire trench. Thorstein crawled out from beneath the dead warlord, his left arm hanging uselessly at his side, his right hand dripping with Halder's lifeblood. He reached down, wrenched Viper's tongue from the dead man's shield, and used the shaft to steady himself as he stood up on the high dais. The remaining Huskarls, seeing their leader stuck like a pig, lost their stomach for the iron. They dropped their weapons, falling to their knees in the bloody straw, their hands raised in the ancient sign of submission. Kveldulv approached the dais, his face covered in soot and blood that was not his own. He looked at Thorstein's shoulder, then at the dead warlord on the floor. "The fort is ours," Kveldulv said, his breath coming in long, ragged gasps. "But Jarl Erik will hear of this before the moon turns. He will bring the whole western fleet, Thorstein. He will bring 300 ships." Thorstein looked out through the shattered doors of the hall, past the burning village below, toward the cold, grey horizon where the first light of dawn was beginning to bleed into the sea. Let him come, Thorstein said, lifting Viper's tongue high so the remaining men could see the blood on its iron edge. He thinks he is the Jarl of the land. But from this day until the crows have my meat, we are the kings of the ash.